We're going to take a look now at one early connectionist model from the 1960s, 70s. And it will give us an insight into why these models seem so appealing. We remember that at this stage in the game, the relationship of the neural networks to ideas about how brains might work is very much at the forefront of people's minds. And psychologists who are working within the framework of cognitive psychology found a lot to think about in such models. So we're going to see now one early network which was developed in order to speak to the concerns of psychologists. Now, psychologists do not deal with brains. Psychologists deal with people, and they put them into various experimental contexts, and they draw inferences about their makeup. This particular effect was well known to psychologists. It had been the subject of many experiments. Psychologists love some experiments. And this is called the word superiority effect. And as ever, the reason this particular effect got so much attention was not because it could be robustly induced, but because it seemed somewhat paradoxical. And when we have a paradox or a puzzle, there's a natural tendency to try to see if we can eliminate it or resolve it in some sense. And the overall framework of human cognition that this was speaking to was at that stage concerned with the idea that prior knowledge can influence what you see. Now, seeing is a very rich topic, which is not sufficiently well addressed with theories of visual perception. Many questions you might have about seeing cannot even be expressed within this framework. But if we restrict ourselves to this specific framework, we can speak of seeing as resulting from perceptual processes, from visual input. And yet what you see is determined not only by what happens on the retina, but by what you already know. So let's have a look at how the word superiority effect is demonstrated. To begin with, the subject in an experiment to demonstrate this would be asked into the laboratory, where they would be sat down and faced with a screen. And there in the middle of the screen is a cross. This is called a fixation cross. And before we go on, I want to say something about that fixation cross. I said many of the questions you will have about seeing cannot be addressed within such frameworks. To use a fixation cross is to induce a particular kind of seeing, which is entirely distinct from that which goes on when subjects are free to move around their environment and choose where to look. But within this framework, it is assumed that seeing can be studied by holding the subject still, presenting something to them, and asking them about what they saw. So are you ready? Okay, I skipped through 2 slides there. On the previous slide, there was a word. It went by very quickly. I don't know if you saw it. The question being asked of the subject is, after such a brief presentation and a visual display that now contains visual noise, that's the ampersands, where the word previously was, what was in the middle position there? Was it a U or was it an A? Now, I went through that so fast you didn't notice. I'll go back. There's the word. Actually has 6 letters, not 5. That's my mistake. But in the third position, there's a U. And if this went through that quickly, subjects would be uncertain whether what they saw was a U or an A. And the visual display times would be chosen so that from the responses we could tell that they're doing better than chance while still feeling uncertain. This is how psychological methods are developed and fine-tuned. Now, when we compare conditions, the paradox arises. On the left-hand side here, you see a sequence in which a single letter is produced and then replaced with a mask. And let's say subjects are getting this correct 60% of the time, where 50% is chance. So if you guess between E and T, you'll get it right 50% of the time. And subjects are doing 60% of the time, which is better than chance, but they're still very unsure. And now in the middle, we have a non-word, not a random association or sequence of letters, something which could be a word, but is not a word, clean. Here, subjects do somewhat better than in the individual letter case. That's kind of odd, isn't it? There's a lot more visual junk going on. There's still only a single letter that they're being asked to attend to, and yet they're doing better here than when the letter was on its own. And on the right-hand side, we see the word condition, in which the middle display displays a whole word and is then covered up. And here subjects do substantially better than in the single letter case. I hope you can see why this finding is paradoxical. The timings have been chosen so that subjects' responses lie in this grey area between certainty and complete ignorance. Nonetheless, we can distinguish between their successes here, and the addition of what looks like visual noise seems to help them. So the fact that there's a word there seems to help in identifying a single letter. Now, we could have added a fourth condition in here, which, unlike the middle condition, would contain a sequence of letters, but those letters did not make up a hypothetical word. People there would do worse than in the single letter condition. So the improved performance on this task depends critically on the letter being attended to being presented in the context of something which is either meaningful in the case of a word or potentially meaningful in the case of a non-word. So this was going around in this world of cognitive psychology, and there's nothing like a good experimental finding like this to get people developing box and arrow models and hypothesizing about brains and Lord knows what. And it's here that a network model was introduced to allow a way to think about these kinds of things. So the network model aspires to providing, first of all, a slightly more formal way of reasoning about the interaction between top-down knowledge, assumed already present in the subject, and new information presented through sensory channels, which combines in an act of recognition. Then, if the model helps in thinking about this, the model could guide the development of theories about what's actually going on. Now, the model is a little bit complex, and I'm only showing part of it here. It comes from 1981. J. McClelland and Dave Rummelhart produced this model. And because it's an early model, this is a model not concerned with training. Assume the weights are already given, and in fact, these weights are carefully selected by hand. There are three layers in this network. There's an input layer, which is here called the feature level. There's a second layer called the letter level, and a third layer called the word level. Now, despite those names, each level contains simple processing units that do nothing more than calculate sums. So where we say features, we mean numbers to which the researchers have assigned meaning. And here they're assigning meaning as if the number stood in correspondence to a specific visual feature that might be present in the visual input. So on the bottom left-hand side, you see a horizontal bar in a high position. If that's present in the letter A presented, for example, then we will give some positive value to the A node at the feature level. So we are going to dictate the values at the feature level. Activation at the feature level will then percolate up to the letter level. And here you can see there's a letter A which is connected to that first feature, and it has connections to all the visual features. And some of those weights will be what we call excitatory. They will be positive numbers, so that activation of that feature, if that feature is present, the net input to the letter unit will be increased. And some of them will be inhibitory, so that if the feature is not present in a given letter, then they will contribute negatively to the net input. This is indicated on the diagram here, again of part of the network, whereby arrows with an actual arrow at the end are assumed to be positive numbers. These are excitatory connections. And those with a little dot at the end are assumed to be inhibitory connections. Now, the basic logical structure of the network layers is shown on the left. We present the features, they percolate up to the letter level, which percolates up to the word level, and percolates back down again to the letter level. This is something beyond the network structure we saw before. This is not a feed-forward network, it's a recurrent network. What this means is we will present some numbers at the feature level corresponding to hypothetical visual input. The letter level will compute its values, and the word level will compute its values. And then the letter level will compute its values again, now having input from both the features and from the words. Those will percolate up to the word levels, and there's a reverberation then that goes on between the letter level and the word level. Attending on the right-hand side, what's shown here is input for a single letter position only. At the bottom, the circles with the vertical bars stand in correspondence to individual numbers. If the feature is present, that will be a 1. If the feature is absent, that will be a 0. The letter nodes are connected to all the features, excitatory connections between features which occur in the letter, and inhibitory connections between features which do not occur in the letter. Then the letter level projects up to the word level, again excitatory if the letter appears in the word, and inhibitory if the letter does not appear in the word. So following the connection from A to trip, we see an inhibitory connection because A does not occur in trip. There are connections between units at the word level, and these are of an inhibitory nature. Ultimately, we will be asking this network to recognize a whole word, and if the word happens to be trip, then it's not able. So it's assumed that over time, one of the units at the word level will become maximally active and the others will be inhibited, so that we will say the network has recognized the word. That's our interpretation. We've set things up so that in the computation of values, one unit will have a significant value and the others will not. Now, but this only shows recognition for a single letter. So we need to look at the whole network, and as you can see, it's a bit more complicated. Down at the feature level, we have a bunch of feature nodes for each of 4 positions. We will be considering here only 4-letter words. And each of those features projects to a separate set of units for letters. So an A in the first position is distinct from an A in the second position. There is only, however, a single word layer, and each of the 4 letters connects to that word in as much as that letter is present in that position within the word. So the word here, if the word were time, you can see there are positive excitatory connections with the letters T in the first position, I, M, and E in their respective positions. Each of those is in turn connected through positive connections with the features that make up the letter T, I, M, and E, and all the inhibitory connections are not shown here. Within the letter level in the position, there are inhibitory connections because the letter in position 4 is either an A or an E, but it's not both. Whew! So the units are interpreted as meaning hypotheses about the visual input at several levels, at the feature level, at the letter level, and at the word level. The excitatory connections, the positive weights in this network, draw out consistent relations. The inhibitory connections prevent multiple nodes becoming activated which are mutually inconsistent. As we said, there's only one letter in each position and there's only one word overall. Within a layer, so within the letter units for 4th position, or within the word, or within the features at 4th position, I'm not sure about that one. There are inhibitory connections. So actually that should not be there in the feature level, because multiple features will be active in fourth position, but they speak of only one letter. Apologies for the slight inconsistency there. This business of lateral inhibition among nodes whose interpretation is mutually inconsistent was a very powerful architectural innovation of such networks, and stood in rich correspondence then to the interpretations of neuroscientists as they studied patterns of cortical activation in perceptual processes. Now, we present something at the feature level, then the letter level nodes compute their activations, and the word level nodes compute their activations. Go to the next time step. We've left the feature levels unchanged, so they're still going up to the letter level. But now some words have become active, and so the letters are now receiving input from above and from below. In turn, the new activations at the letter level will lead to changes in the activations at the word level. And this goes on in a reverberatory cycle, hopefully setting down to some equilibrium, at which, as here, a consistent interpretation of the input arises, which is the word time. So we can follow the activation of units in the different levels through time, through processing steps. Time is discretized. We present our features, we update everything, letters then words. Now we're going to update everything again, letters then words. Now we're going to update everything again. So that's time 1, 2, 3. And in the graphs there, you can see those nodes which are maximally active over time. The input here, shown below, is interesting because it contains clear, unambiguous information about the letter in the first, second, and third position. But that fourth position is deliberately ambiguous. Someone spilt ink on it. So we present features here which are compatible with both the letter OR and the letter K. And look what happens over time. Initially, at the letter level, both OR and K exhibit rising activation because the few features that are presented are compatible with both OR and K. They percolate up to the top level. However, there's only one word at the top level that begins with the letters W, O, OR. And so over time, as the word work and other words exhibit partial activation, they feed back to the letter level. And the likelihood of that fourth letter being OR starts to drop now because it's not getting any positive feedback from above, from any word. The word worry is not up there, for example, because we only have 4-letter words. And so positive activation from the word work comes down, and ultimately the network ends up in a stable state where it disambiguates the visual input through the prior knowledge it has at the word level. So this was of great interest to neuropsychologists, cognitive psychologists, and to some extent the patterns seen in the physiology could be interpreted in a manner analogous to that which goes on in this interactive activation model. We call it interactive activation because everything's interacting with everything, and activation values are changing over time. We have the direct input, which produces a manifest effect at the layer level, and this is then modified by the context in which it occurs, and this was compatible with many theories of visual processing. You can play with this actual model at the URL given on the slide there. We described this model as having been developed in order to account for the word superiority effect. But it's worth noting that this apparently paradoxical experimental result was very much of a kind with many problems, puzzles, and hypothetical models that were being developed within psychology at the time, in which the role of pre-existing knowledge and novel sensory input were considered because it was quite clear that you perceive the world not only in terms of raw sensory input, but also in terms of your expectations, your prior knowledge, your biases, and so on. So without going into the same level of detail, we'll just mention one other model of a similar architecture, similar three-layer architecture with features at the bottom, which we will provide numbers for. Instead of letters, we have here phonemes. Those are the hypothetical sound units of which words are composed in linguistic theory, and higher up word levels. So we've got a similar sort of thing, except that the features here are derived not from visual input, but actually they're derived from an analysis of sound. So the processing here is not from visual input to word recognition, but from sound input to word recognition. Of course, the network only deals in numbers. There are no actual sounds, there's no actual words, just as there was no images and no actual words previously. We have the same architecture with inhibition within layers, sequential input, but the features here have been extracted from speech. The word units are compatible with some phonemes and not with other ones. And the interaction between top-down and bottom-up processes here should be familiar to you. You know that if you're listening to somebody talk and some sound happens like that occurs, I keep doing it in between my words, but supposing it happens in the middle of a long word like hippopotamus. My clap occluded one of those sounds, and yet you heard the word hippopotamus. So you filled in a sense, because you know the word hippopotamus, and I was unlikely to say hiccupotamus. So these general questions about prior knowledge and sensory input are finding a particular expression in these network models, in which they're allowed to interact. The general class of model here is called the interactivation model. And in the laboratory, we'll be getting to play with one of these IA models. In fact, the one we'll be playing with was very influential. It's neither of the two we've just looked at. But it was distributed on floppy disks with a set of books, which we'll come back to later. These are called the PDP books. They were published in 1986, and they introduced backpropagation. And this book series single-handedly kicked off the second wave of connectionism that we'll be dealing with. One of the genius marketing moves made by the group who produced these books was to produce a third book and a floppy disk with worked exercises so that upcoming graduate students, like myself in the early 90s, could get these floppy disks and could play with these models immediately. If you really want to get people to take your work seriously, don't speak to the professors. Speak to the young graduate students and give them something to play with. Turns out that's a very effective way of propagating your ideas. The model in question is somewhat whimsical. It's based on the gangs in the West Side Story. The gangs are the Jets and the Sharks. We'll go through the structure of this in lab. You just have a quick view of it there. But it'll give you an idea for these early interactive activation networks in which the activation of the units is constantly changing over time as everything updates itself, one clock tick to the next. And the network as a whole settles down in some stable pattern, which we then interpret. So that'll be fun.